This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is Derrell Peel, Oklahoma State University livestock economist, as he talks about the cattle market, global beef production, and the impact weather has or could have on the industry. Drew Ricketts, K-State wildlife specialist, keeps the show rolling as he shares his annual reminders of snakes in Kansas and how people should handle encounters. K-State livestock entomologist Cassandra Olds ends the show talking about bovine theileriosis. We also hear from Rod Bain and David Gruchot as they discuss invasive pests and diseases. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Monday show with a cattle market update from Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. Derrell, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Derrell, when we look at the overall cattle market, how are things looking?
We're still moving very strong. It's springtime. We typically see a lot of strength in prices seasonally. And there's, even in a strong trending market like we've had for a long time now, we still see some of the seasonal effects. So, feeder cattle prices have been very strong, with some variability. Fed cattle markets, same thing. We're very close to, if not at, record prices, hanging in there. So, and boxed beef markets, boxed beef has actually pulled back slightly from an early March run up, but it's starting to go back up again here more typically for April as we get ready for Memorial Day and the beginning of grilling season.
What caused that boxed beef pullback?
Well, I think we got a little ahead of ourselves in some sense. I mean, there was an early run. Of course, beef production is down pretty significantly this year. For the year to date, beef production's down over 6%. That's a little bigger than we're projecting it for the whole year, at least at this point. So we'll see. But I suspect that some of the retailers actually got a little nervous about beef supplies, beef availability, and booked some stuff a little bit earlier. And then, like I said, we pull back slightly. We're still well ahead of prices this time last year. So even with a little bit of a pullback, we're still very, very strong and higher on a year-over-year basis.
And thinking of those retailers, do you feel like there might be a continued concern about having beef in their stores?
We're not likely to actually run out, but supplies are tight, and retailers can worry about minor disruptions in that, and just making sure they have product, and I think there's a certain sense of relief in knowing that you've got product booked, and as we get into the heavier demand season. So there's just a lot of this is part of the process. When beef supplies get tight, the market's going to be rationing that product. We do that with higher prices, but there is limitations on quantities as well to some extent.
When we're thinking about beef production, has there recently been a country that is now beating the U.S.?
On a global scale, we have seen a fairly significant shift. Last year, 2025, for the first time ever, Brazil exceeded the U.S. as the largest beef producing country in the world. And they're projected to continue that in the U.S. Now, of course, we're down cyclically. It's at some point, we think we will turn the corner here on this cattle cycle and rebuild our numbers and our beef production somewhat. But Brazil has been growing for a long time. They've got twice as many beef cows as we have in the U.S. They don't have the level of productivity that we do in the U.S., so they just barely exceed us in terms of total beef production, but they have the numbers, so they're going to continue to be there as we go forward.
For Brazil's maybe less productive cattle, are they having to harvest their cattle later, or they're just harvesting smaller cattle?
Well, they're kind of like our industry was about 50 or 60 years ago. So it's, carcass weights are smaller. Overall productivity is less. So their calf crop percentage and their survivability of cattle is less. So they're making progress, but again, they're at an earlier stage in their development compared to where we've gotten to. So, if you look at it across the whole system, they just don't produce as many pounds of beef per cow as we do in the U.S. And so even with a lot more cattle, again, they've got twice as many cows, so they can produce a lot of beef, but it takes a lot for them to do that.
Do they have dairy cattle integrated into their market like we do?
They would have a dairy sector, and in every country, there's going to be, dairy contributions to the beef industry. I don't know that there's, we've seen a really big change in the U.S. now with the crossbred calves and a much more direct linkage between beef and dairy sectors. But in any country, ultimately, those cows, even though they're used primarily for dairy production for their productive life, at the end of the thing, they're going to become part of the beef supply.
At some point, hopefully, the U.S. rebuilds their cattle herd. Do you see the U.S. coming that top beef producer again?
I do expect some recovery here. We're down cyclically in terms of beef production, so it's not clear exactly how it'll go. I wouldn't be surprised if the U.S. doesn't return back to being the largest beef producer at some point once we rebuild a little bit. But my guess is going forward, it's going to be more of a close race, if you will, between the U.S. and Brazil. We're probably going to stay kind of neck and neck as we go forward here in terms of being the top two and by far dominant in terms of global beef production.
And coming back to our markets, recently in Kansas and Oklahoma, we had some severe weather, part of that being tornadoes. And does that have any impact on our cattle market?
It's springtime, and especially in the southern plains, it is the time of year when we get a lot of severe weather. Part of that is to get some rain. So, you kind of have to accept the threat of severe weather to get the moisture we need, and we really do need it. But at the same time, severe weather can cause problems. Typically, tornadoes are isolated enough that they don't have overall market impacts. They're just not that big, and now they're tremendously impactful on the people who deal with them, who get hit by them. But usually, they don't have an impact on the overall market. They're just not that big. Now, if you had a situation where a tornado were to hit something like a packing plant, that might be a different story, where you could take a plant, take a plant down. That would have a broader market impact. But in general, these kind of storms just are not big enough in the grand scheme of things to cause an overall market reaction.
And on the flip side of precipitation, severe weather, tornadoes, how is drought looking in Oklahoma, and how are cattle producers feeling?
We've been very, very dry. In fact, if you look at the overall drought map, a lot of the country is pretty dry. And so, that's a real threat for this time of the year. Starting the year in a drought is the worst possible scenario here. So it's really critical to get moisture here in April and May. If you lose that early season forage production, both pastures and hay, it's very difficult to catch up, even if you do get rains later. And so the next 45 to 60 days is going to be pretty critical in a lot of regions. Now we are getting, as you noted, we got some storms here recently across Oklahoma, some of Oklahoma and Kansas, and so that's going to help in some of those regions. But there's some areas that really need moisture that haven't gotten that much yet.
So for places that are seeing drought, do you think that could trigger more selling of livestock, selling of cattle?
That's the threat this year, is that even if we have some indications that at a minimal level, we're trying to retain some heifers. We're trying to start that process of herd rebuilding, but it's all subject to Mother Nature's stamp here. All of those plans could be preempted if we continue to have drought. And ultimately, that could change. Regardless of what we want to do, we will do what we have to do to deal with the conditions that are presented to us. So I think that's going to be really critical going forward. And I think it's one of the reasons why producers in many places have not been very aggressive about trying to restock. They're just not that far away from drought in many cases. And with the conditions that we see, the potential to get back into drought is high enough that a lot of producers just, from a financial, you don't want to start off on something, make investments and so on, and then have to turn around and be forced to liquidate if the conditions, go sideways on you here. So I think that is definitely one of the limiting factors that's holding producers back and having them be very cautious about how aggressive they're going to be.
Derrell, as we look forward in the cattle market for these next few months, then, what do you think cattle producers can be expecting?
We're still enjoying this high price scenario. Producers are trying to find ways to take advantage of that. In some cases, they are down in stocking, so they're at least potentially thinking about restocking. But there's a lot of considerations in that. So I think the main thing is for producers to try to take advantage of the market that we have and be prepared for that. Obviously high prices don't help you if you don't have something to sell. So you've got to continue to try to produce. But with all of the things we've talked about, weather and so on, you also have to continue to manage that. We've got lots of volatility in these markets, lots of shocks right now, some input price shocks, given the broader global situation, if you will. And so there's lots of things for producers to keep an eye on, but at the same time, we're in a very, very favorable market environment for the most part, certainly for cow-calf producers. And that's where the market's focused right now, trying to stimulate that some level of rebuilding in the beef cow herd.
Derrell, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
You bet. Happy to visit with you.
That was Oklahoma State University livestock economist Derrell Peel. If you'd like to check out more work from Derrell, you can do so by finding his Cow-Calf Corner newsletter through Oklahoma State University Extension, which you can find by simply searching for Oklahoma State University Extension Beef. Or I will also link it in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our Monday show having our annual discussion about snakes with K-State wildlife specialist Drew Ricketts. Drew, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Shelby.
Drew, what snakes might people find in Kansas?
We have 42 species of snakes in Kansas, and 7 of them are venomous. So it's much more likely that you're going to encounter a non-venomous snake than a venomous one. And, people who enjoy seeing snakes are probably going to recognize many different species. Some common ones that we would see throughout the state would be a couple of different species of rat snakes. The western rat snake is one that we typically would call a black rat snake because most of them are black. There's also a Great Plains rat snake. There's a gopher snake, which is the one that most people would call bull snakes. They've been changing the names of some of these snakes recently, and so we get some of these confusing things like that. Several different species of water snakes, garter snakes, and ribbon snakes are some that many people would be familiar with. And then there are 7 species of snakes that are venomous. So we've got 2 species of copperheads. We've got the prairie rattlesnake, the Massasauga rattlesnake, the timber rattlesnake. There are a couple of spots in Kansas where you might see a western diamondback. One of those is an introduced population at Canopolis Lake. And then down in south central Kansas, their range just barely gets up into Oklahoma. And then the cottonmouth has been detected in Kansas in the extreme southeast corner down by Riverton, Baxter Springs, that area. But there hasn't been a cottonmouth detected in Kansas since the early 90s. And so that species is likely not present, but it is commonly confused with many different water snakes that we have throughout the state, because all water snakes, including the cottonmouth, have a very broad head. They also have a pretty broad or girthy body relative to their length, and they have some scale characteristics that make them look like a venomous snake as well. But if we look closely, we can see that the water snakes that are not venomous have a round pupil. They will have vertical barring on what we would think of as being their lips, and that sets them apart from the cottonmouth. And there are some other characteristics too, but those are some easy ones to see in pictures a lot of times that I identify when folks send in to me.
Do we see snakes being aggressive or more of a I'll leave you alone if you leave me alone perspective?
It's typically the live and let live type perspective. So, if you disturb a snake, then they are going to let you know they're there. A rattlesnake would shake its rattles. There are many different species of snakes that would move their tail and make sort of a rattling sound, but it would be incredibly rare for a snake to actually chase a person. And so, if someone does not know how to identify snakes, or if we are fearful of snakes, then really the best thing to do when we encounter one is just to go the other way. If you walk away, that snake is very unlikely to follow you. If it's in an area that you need to come back to after a while, if you stay away for 30 minutes, it's most likely that snake is going to be gone and you can go back about your business.
What habitats or environments do snakes prefer to live in?
Sure. So the water snakes that we have, of course, like to be around water, and that can be flowing water or it can be ponds or lakes. Lots of vegetation around shorelines, rocks around shorelines, and those sorts of things. When we think about snakes being around homes or in yards, important habitat there is going to be cover that might include vegetation. So, and that can even be vegetation that we have out there for landscaping. So the thicker it is, the more likely it's going to provide cover for critters like snakes. Also rocks, and especially rocks that are layered or stacked, that can even be pavers. And so many of the landscaping features that we might want to add to a yard can be features that snakes are also attracted to. Brush piles, old equipment, old sheds that are open or that have raised foundations that are up on skids and that sort of thing, open crawl spaces or porches that are easy to get under. All of those things provide cover and make it more likely that you're going to encounter a snake in the yard than if those items weren't there.
Could people also be encountering snakes in their homes?
Sure. Snakes come into homes. They're not coming into a home, because they're trying to encounter you. And I think sometimes we think that might be what's going on. But, typically if a snake enters a home, they're just exploring and they're looking for warm places potentially, or they're hunting, they're looking for food, exploring the environment. And we can really minimize having snakes in a home by sealing it up. That includes having tight seals under our doors, also under garage doors and those sorts of things, making sure we don't have gaps between building materials and the foundation of the home, just sealing everything up very tight. Snakes can get through very small gaps. And so that's very, very important to have good construction. And then another thing to consider is if we've got old rock foundations to a home or features in a basement, for instance, like a cistern or something like that, that provides great habitat for snakes. And so if we have lots of snakes entering a home, then those are the kinds of things that we want to look for. And if we find them, then we really need to seal those up to prevent the snakes from getting inside the house. But if we do find a snake in the house, if you can ensure that it's non-venomous, we can just catch that snake and move it back outside. We can also put sticky traps like the glue traps that sometimes we see advertised for mice. The larger ones of those are designed for snakes, and you can find some that say that they are a snake trap. And in a home, really those can be used especially behind furniture, appliances, and those sorts of things, because snakes will oftentimes follow walls and other structure. And if we place those glue traps behind couches or other appliances and furniture, then it prevents our pets or children and those sorts of things from getting stuck in those sticky traps as well.
You mentioned the snakes hunting and looking for food. So what are they hunting for?
Yeah, we've got snakes in Kansas that have a very broad range in their diet. If we think about all the different species, the water snakes would eat lots of fish. They would eat frogs. They would eat invertebrates that might be in ponds. They would eat other snakes. And we have water snakes that eat other snakes. We also have terrestrial snakes that eat other snakes and lizards, and that includes venomous snakes. So king snakes are well known for catching and eating venomous snakes. Black rat snakes, or the western rat snake that I mentioned before, that species will also catch and eat venomous snakes sometimes, eating lots of rats and mice and other critters like that we may not want to see around a home, insects. So, snakes are eating lots of things that we are benefiting from their diet. And so when we talk about snakes being good to have around, that's typically what we're thinking about. But it's also important to be able to identify those venomous snakes so that you can stay away from them, not handle a snake that could cause you harm and those sorts of things.
If someone does have a snake in their home or a place that the snake really should not be, and they've identified it as non-venomous, what's the removal process look like for getting it out of that area?
If you have snake tongs, then you could grab the snake with the snake tongs. And if you don't know what those are, do an internet search. You can find those. And if you're in an area where you see lots of snakes that you might need to move, whether it's in your home or whether it's outside, then snake tongs might be a good investment to make. We can also pin them down. So you could take a stick or other longer object and apply light pressure behind the head and then grasp the snake behind the head where it can't bite you, and so that you're immobilizing that head. And then with your other hand, grab the back end of the snake, and then we can pick it up. You could place it in a 5-gallon bucket and put a lid over it while you move it, or you can just carry it to another place that you can then release it to. And snakes are one of those species that oftentimes we relocate. So we might move it 100 yards or something like that to get it out of an area where we don't want it to be. And so that's a little bit different than when we discuss not wanting to translocate other wildlife, where we're moving them outside of their normal home range to try and prevent them to come back.
And if someone finds a snake and isn't able to confidently identify that it's non-venomous, what should they do?
Walking away is a great thing to do, because it's very likely that when you come back in a half hour or longer, that snake will be gone. You also may be able to call a nuisance wildlife control professional, and our offices can connect you with the contact information for those folks. So can Wildlife and Parks. But you may be able to hire somebody to come out and remove a snake for you if that's something that needs to be done as well.
Drew, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely. I always enjoy it.
That was K-State Wildlife Specialist Drew Ricketts. You can find more from K-State's wildlife team by going to their website, Wildlife.K-State.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we conclude our show hearing from K-State livestock entomologist Cassandra Olds as she discusses bovine theileriosis.
Bovine theileriosis is prevalent over much of the United States, especially the East Coast. We're seeing it crop up and move westward over time, especially here in Kansas. This is a protozoan disease that has no treatment and no vaccine, so we're going to chat about what you need to be on the lookout for. So this pathogen is transmitted by ticks, but can also be moved around by sharing needles between infected and uninfected animals and biting flies. So we need to keep a track of our animals, whether they're on pasture or in the feed yard. Once an animal is infected, it stays a carrier for life, and any stress event can cause a relapse. So we're starting to see a lot of outbreaks in our stocker cattle as they come onto grass, but also in the feed yards. So you're going to want to pay attention to cattle. Look for animals that are lethargic, animals who have gone off feed. You will have an anemia response later on. They're going to be really exercise intolerant and just look pretty depressed. Have a good relationship with your veterinarian, because they're going to rely on you to let them know when something's wrong, and you're going to rely on them to try and help you get your animals through these outbreaks. If you ever need any information, feel free to reach out to us here at Kansas State University. We're doing some really great research at the moment, looking at what is the impact of Theileria on cattle production systems and different stages of production, and also looking at the movement of these within a herd in the absence of the tick vector. Keep an eye out for the Asian longhorn tick. This is a tick that was just discovered for the first time in Kansas in late last year. You're going to want to look out for abnormally high tick infestations. This is a regular looking brown tick. Keep an eye on your animals, keep an eye on your pastures. If you notice higher than usual tick burdens, feel free to give us a call and we'll come out and take a look.
Once again, that was K-State livestock entomologist Cassandra Olds discussing bovine theileriosis. We're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and David Gruchot of the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service.
The threat of invasive plant pests and diseases to our nation's ecosystems, whether a farm field or your backyard flower and vegetable garden. And as David Gruchot of the Agriculture Department's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service points out, there are plenty of threats to worry about.
Some different types of invasive pests that we're concerned about: Asian longhorn beetle, spongy moth, those are both forest pests. Invasive fruit flies, spot-horn lanternfly is another one.
This is why USDA annually generates public awareness through its Invasive Plant Pest and Disease Awareness Month.
Invasive pests often arrive accidentally on plants, produce, wood packing material, or even outdoor gear, and people can unknowingly spread them by moving firewood or outdoor equipment, buying agricultural products from overseas, traveling with fruits and vegetables.
So what can be done to prevent the spread of invasive plant pests and diseases? Gruchot says, start with knowing how these pests are transported.
Invasive species can hitchhike on cars and trucks, also other things outdoors, trailers, boats. So we encourage folks to clean their vehicles, particularly after traveling through forests, parks, or rural areas. If you're returning from international travel, tell U.S. officials about any agricultural items you're bringing back, including food, plants, and even souvenirs that could be made from wood or other natural materials, because they could harbor pests.
And what to spot in the case of specific invasive pests.
Forest pests like Asian longhorn beetle, one of their preferred host trees is maple, so it can be impacting maple trees in your own backyard, in your neighborhood. Spongy moth has a preferred host list of over 300 species, but its preferred host is oak. It could be impacting your own neighborhood or in your own yard if you happen to have any type of oak trees.
An online resource is available for you to learn more about invasive plant pests and diseases and how to prevent their spread. www.hungrypest.com.
USDA's Hungry Pest campaign raises public awareness about invasive species and what all of us can do to prevent them. People can visit USDA's Hungry Pest website that has photos and all sorts of information on different pests. You can even select the state that you're located in to help narrow it down to pests that may be of concern locally. And you can also check state agriculture department websites for more information.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
That's what we have for you today on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you tomorrow.